Hey guys, so this is You Get What You Paid For by Karan Parikh.
And Matt Olney.
Hi, we'd like to discuss to you today about the dangers of miscommunication in aviation through a case study of an incident that occurred in a Piper Cherokee 6.
The pilot, Greg Ellison, encountered darkness and bad weather that he wasn't trained to fly in and lost a wing from wind shear. The situation could have easily been avoided by having better communication in various different ways.
In this incident, we will discuss an accident that happened in a Piper Cherokee 6, a single-engine plane that was poorly maintained. The pilot, Greg Ellison, had his commercial rating with 520 hours of flight time, but with only 18 hours of instrument training, and his night currency elapsing 11 months earlier in the incident flight.
Preparations for the flight started 2 days prior as a charter flight from ProCharter Inc., an aircraft charter and rental service based at Harry P. Davis Airfield in Manassas, Virginia. The airplane was rented on a personal basis by a part-time charter pilot who would then be reimbursed in cash in advance by the passengers who were traveling with him to Myrtle Beach for a one-day look at a lake resort property. ProCharter clearly advised Greg, the pilot, that they did not want any official record of their out-of-annual, non-airworthy Cherokee 6 being rented to anyone. A charter in an illegal plane flown by an unqualified pilot, and they could be held responsible. They definitely did not want that.
The Cherokee was well past its required maintenance for its 100-hour and annual inspections. It was already 37 hours overdue, plus repair or replacement of the vacuum system and directional gyro was needed. The COM number 1 and nav number 2 had also been inoperative for nearly 6 months, but neither radio was scheduled for repair. The original pilot also backed out last minute and was replaced by a less experienced pilot, Greg Ellison, a 26-year-old with no instrument rating and no night currency.
The intended flight path of the Cherokee 6 was from Manassas, Virginia to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and back. On the return trip, however, the weather deteriorated quickly and they crashed 35 miles northeast of Blackstone AAF. At the cruising speed of 147 knots, which the Cherokee 6 had, this trip would have taken a bit over 2 hours. And this would obviously be in no wind, or it would basically be in ideal conditions, which you can see we've plotted out on SkyVector online.
The events leading up to the crash went like this. The pilot headed northeast at 2100 feet MSL and climbed to 2400 feet. He then turned north and descended to 2000 feet. Turning west, he then descended to 1500 feet, and right after this, radar contact was lost 1 mile from the crash site in John Kerr Reservoir, 132 nautical miles away from their intended destination and 179 nautical miles away from their departure zone.
The weather the day of the incident was VFR all day and was forecast to worsen throughout the day and be okay in Manassas until after midnight. The flight to Myrtle Beach was calm and clear. Having unexpected delays from the passengers, Greg made the decision to fly anyways, even though he wasn't IFR or night rated. Heading towards Manassas, the clouds were lowering, and at the time of the crash, it was speculated that the clouds were 1,300 broken with 3 statute miles in rain and fog. Flying under an embedded thunderstorm cell, Greg then experienced heavy rain and turbulence that ripped the plane from the sky. Weather data confirmed that thunderstorms were present near the crash site at the time of the accident. It was also learned that the pilot had received a complete weather briefing just before takeoff and had spoken to Flight Watch shortly before the encounter with the weather.
At 8 a.m. the morning of the crash, the pilot arrived and confirmed that the weather would be good enough for both legs of the flight, but was supposed to get worse after midnight. At 9:20 a.m., 4 passengers arrived, and at 9:45 a.m., the plane departed for Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Once they arrived, the passengers told Greg that they would be back for around 6:30 p.m., which was already an hour and a half behind his planned schedule. At 6:10 p.m., Greg received a call informing him that he would be delayed another couple hours, and at 8:15 they finally took off. By this time, the weather was getting worse and the sky darkened. After this last recorded time, the plane was downed. The events of the accident. The airplane started to spin to the left. Greg pulled hard right on the control wheel to stop the rapid descent. Then it was hard right rudder, followed by a sharp left pressure on the wheel as the airplane lurched right and out of control. The Cherokee encountered wind shear, and Greg applied hard down pressure on the yoke, not aware that the airspeed indicator was past the red line and pegging itself at the top. The old Cherokee couldn't handle the pressure and the G-forces, forcing the wings away from the fuselage. They crashed on the eastern side of the reservoir, and the wings second later, 700 feet east, and nearly disintegrated.
Alright, the first point I want to bring up is the fact that when Greg calls ProCharter for advice, he doesn't get any real help. The first time he calls, he speaks with the brother, and the brother decides to not give him any advice and tells him to call back later because it's too early to make a decision, which I guess is fair. But the second time he calls back, both the brothers have left because it's past 6, and there's only a new pilot there who didn't really apparently know the procedures. If the brother had told Greg to call back and that they would speak again and make a decision, he should hold his word to that and he should show up for that. Also, it wouldn't really make sense for two co-owners of a small aircraft company to leave a brand new pilot who they said was inexperienced, all in charge of an FBO that had planes currently dispatched. Another serious mistake made throughout this incident was that no flight plan was filed. This creates a serious miscommunication between Greg and the controllers because the controllers have absolutely no idea of what's going on with Greg's flight and cannot readily track him if anything were to happen, which it basically ended up happening anyways. With the tardiness of the passengers, it was approaching nighttime and also the validity period of the forecast for the bad weather. Um, this this lateness or this anxiousness to get back pushed Greg into making the tough decision of whether or not to go. Feeling good, Greg pushed his luck and felt overconfident in his flying. The biggest sort of miscommunication I find was the actual communication between the bosses and Greg himself. Greg shouldn't have gone anywhere close to that plane if he was well aware of the fact that there had many systems missing and many of the nav aids not working. Greg knew that the plane was not airworthy and that the maintenance was not done on the plane. They might have pressured him into making it home, but his macho attitude also pushed him into this bad situation.
The following is an excerpt taken from an FAA investigator's written report. So many things were wrong with the airplane that we immediately contacted the owners to get the maintenance records on the airplane, but they claimed they did not have any, that everything was destroyed in the crash. Field investigations turned up only the airplane's pink sheet, but no other logs or records of any kind. The FAA immediately went to ProCharter to get the maintenance records for the plane. The company claimed they didn't have them and they were destroyed in the accident, and the FAA was also met with outright refusals to talk to them. The Jarrett brothers said they would be forced to sell their company because of the financial loss.
The FAA also stated the following quote: The radar data available verified that the primary cause of the accident was spatial disorientation. This was a typical result of VFR into IMC by an inexperienced pilot. It was followed by a catastrophic failure of the entire wing assembly prior to impact. The wings are found 700 feet east of the main crash site. Also contributing to the accident was the condition of the airplane. However, the damage was so severe that only the vacuum system and the directional gyros could be confirmed as inoperative prior to the crash.
Ralph Jarrett, former co-owner of Pro Charter, had this to say about the crash. There were some things about Greg Ellison that we didn't find out until after the accident. We knew he wasn't IFR rated, but he told us he was taking instrument training and had also been flying co-pilot for another charter service. None of this was true. When he called the first time from Myrtle Beach, my brother took the call and told him to let us know when the passengers were ready to go. We would then decide if it was okay after we checked the current weather. There was no point in making the decision in advance without knowing what time they'd be leaving. The second time he called, my brother and I were both gone. It was sometime after 6 p.m. The only person around was one of the charter pilots who just read him the note from the scheduling sheet that said the airplane had to be back for servicing early tomorrow morning. Supposedly Greg asked if there would be an extra charge if he brought the airplane back after midnight or the next day, and the pilot told him he thought there would be. That wasn't true. We'd never have a rule like that, but the pilot was new and didn't know his way around very well. It was a shame that he was the only person there to take the call. Anyone else would have told Greg to stay put until the weather had cleared out.
Another quote here we have from Ralph Jarrett quotes him saying, "As you can imagine, the accident hurt us very badly. We lost Pro Charter as a result of it, but we managed to get back in the business, barely, because one of our investors decided to keep us afloat. We also had a bad time with the FAA, but they couldn't prove anything, so all that happened was it wound up costing us a bunch of money that would have been better spent on airplane maintenance, which is still a problem for us. We don't ever seem to have enough capital to buy decent equipment or keep what we have in good shape."
Right now, things are a little better. We're still flying very old airplanes, but we can't get an adequate insurance policy because of all of the losses we've had. But we should be out of the woods pretty soon. My brother just landed a charter deal with a big casino in Atlantic City, so we're in the market for a Navajo or 414 and 2 more pilots. If this deal brings as much business as it's supposed to, we should be able to make this into a first-class operation and get rid of some of the junk we're flying currently.
2. Ralph Jarrett claims he did not know everything about the pilot before the accident occurred, even though he is a co-owner of a pretty small business. He blames the pilot for not having his IFR rating and also discloses that the pilot was supposedly claiming he had been taking instrument training lessons and also worked as a co-pilot for a separate charter, none of which were true. Apparently the pilot did not train much at all, according to Ralph, and the co-pilot mail runs he did was with an old Apache, and the frequency of work was very, very scarce. Also, in fact, like he mentioned in the quote, his brother spoke with the pilot for the first time. They should have made it a point to say that they should have been able to get back in contact with Greg, or specifically assign the pilot at the FBO that the situation and directions for follow-up procedures. They claim the pilot who answered the phone once that they were gone was a new person, and how the owner of the business could leave someone so new and inexperienced alone at the base. This is one clear example how the lack of communication is adding into the events leading up to the accident. Another noteworthy part of the quote to touch on is the fact that the airplane had to be back for maintenance in the morning when it had been neglected for such a long time. Just seems a little fishy, don't you think? The owners also try to cover their asses by trying to say in a testimonial that if it was them who had spoken with an owner of the company for the second time, they would have absolutely told them to stay put until the weather clears out, which is odd, as the brother should have said that the first time if he really wanted to.
The brothers try to show us their side of the story in this quote. They try to gain sympathy by stating that they lost the business, but then mention that they ended up getting another business through another investor. So they basically are saying that they took a hit, but at the end of the day, they're okay. It seems like they don't really care about the accident. They continue on to mention that the FAA couldn't pin anything on them, and that basically all that has just cost them a lot of money, which they themselves would have specifically spent in maintenance, which I kind of find odd, since the plane was really neglected. We don't even seem to have enough capital to buy decent equipment or keep what we have in good shape. That was another quote they have mentioned, and it really struck a chord with me, because if they're the two owners of the business, then they should really know the ins and out of their business, especially because it's such a small business. And I think, again, this points the finger to them due to a lack of upholding business and safety standards at the end of the day. So now we have a couple of quotes from Harold Davison, the president of Pro Charter Inc. Somebody told the FAA that it was a gypsy charter, dirt cheap, strictly in cash, and strictly off the record. The whole deal was arranged by one of the Jareds. As I'm sure you know, it was illegal as hell, but the word around here is that they did a lot of their business this way.
About the only thing we actually bought from the Jarrett brothers was some maintenance equipment, some parts, and the leased rights to our facility. Other than that, they didn't have anything to sell. Their airplanes would have cost more to bring up to our standards than they were worth.
So we see now that they're pretty well at the bottom of the barrel after this one. They've had several crashes before, which led the insurance companies to initially give them a mediocre insurance policy anyways. After the Cherokee 6 crash, though, they can't even get an adequate policy for their planes anymore or themselves. Both brothers still seem pretty optimistic, however, about their business and are apparently looking for a new plane and 2 new pilots. I don't know about you guys, but I really wouldn't want to fly for this type of company. Now we're going to bring forward some quotes we have from the mother of the pilot, Sarah Ellison. They killed my son. Plain and simple. They killed him. And nobody's doing anything about it. Those 2 animals are back in business and doing the same things they did here in Manassas. Their planes were always missing something or had something broken. Greg used to tell us about it. I could never figure out why he worked for them, but he would always say he sort of had to.
Like the people who managed the airport, they thought the Jarretts should have been arrested for what they did, but they couldn't get anyone to do anything about it either.
When Sarah Ellison has her quotes, you have to understand that she's a grieving mother who despises the Jarrett brothers and how she feels they pushed her son way too hard into taking risky chances. She recalls that the planes they flew were always missing something or had something broken. She had a personal vendetta against these guys because she personally blames the Jarrett brothers for the crash.
So now we have a couple of author comments for you. The problems associated with the cost and the quality of maintenance will intensify. Safety is being compromised as owners and operators find it more and more difficult to locate parts. Mechanics who know how to service many of those very old airplanes, most of which already require the skills of artisans who can hand make parts, are also a declining breed, with replacements nowhere in sight.
All of which leaves present and future aircraft owners and pilots with a strange dilemma. Do they learn to fix as they fly, or do they accept the risk of relying on questionable quality or harder to find maintenance? If nothing else, that perplexing choice will continue to plague the used airplane business by further dissuading potential buyers, especially the ones with real money, because they are less likely to be do-it-yourselfers.
The author comments on the quickly growing problem and cost associated with maintenance. As the general aviation industry becomes smaller and grows older because so few new aircraft are being built. For the thousands of airplanes that long ago reached the vintage state, this is bad news. Safety starts becoming a very real concern when owners cannot deal with the situation. He also mentions how these planes still do and always will require replacement parts, which now need to be handmade due to companies no longer producing them. Custom anything, as we know, requires artisan work, which is a dying breed, and the industry with a not very uplifting future in sight.
So the part of this writing that really got me thinking about this situation is the fact that it really puts people's lives at risk. However, we also have to think about the training techniques we currently use today in aviation. Almost all flight schools have really old planes, some well kept, some not. These planes will need parts, which again Matt was addressing, but these parts basically at the end of the day mean the output of pilots, which you will ultimately need for the aviation industry to thrive. The used plane side of the quote also makes sense because you're always likely to find someone with money who doesn't really want to put the time, effort, and the DIY attitude into a used plane and also have the unreliability of that. And almost always that person is going to opt for a more expensive plane that's newer and that is going to cause him less harm and less hassle at the end of the day. So here's some of the words the NTSB representative had for the case. Nothing about this case is very clear. Our official position is that it was basically pilot error, complicated by several other factors, but in my book, the other factors had more to do with it than the pilot did. The reason we think they must have put some pressure on him to leave was because none of them had brought any luggage. It had also been a very long day for everyone.
We'll never know for sure if it contributed directly to the accident. My guess would be that it did, very directly. Think about how an inexperienced low timer with no rating would do in it. Not very well, if at all. In fact, from what I've seen of partial panel capability, I'd venture that half the instrument pilots flying wouldn't have come through that encounter without tearing the wings off that crate.
Greg was flying an airplane that shouldn't have been allowed to go off the ground. As we know from our flight training, that's still part of pilot error. It's still your responsibility. According to the NTSB, the circumstances leading up to it involve a whole lot of other things. Like the people who owned the airplane had already overwhelmed him with pressures before taking off, or the passengers who probably goaded him into taking off from Myrtle Beach at night in questionable weather. Of course, they may not have guessed that he was unqualified to be a charter pilot, or that he wasn't capable of flying instruments. I'm sure he never mentioned it either. So now we'll move on to the official conclusion. VFR into IMC, lack of night currency, inoperative directional gyro and vacuum system, loss of control due to spatial disorientation, wing overload, and in-flight breakup. Pilot error.
So the question in this accident remains, did it make any difference how new or old or how unairworthy the Cherokee was? After our analysis of the crash, we think so.